Somewhere beneath the cold grey waters off the coast of Northern Ireland, there is a graveyard. Not marked by stones or crosses, no names, no ceremony, just rusting steel and silence, the remains of some of the most feared weapons ever built by human hands. In the final weeks of World War II, Germany's U-boat fleet, the same submarines that had nearly strangled Britain into surrender, sat waiting in harbours across the Baltic and North Sea. Their crews had surrendered. Their war was over. And yet, what happened next to the hundreds of surviving U-boats that remained at the end of the war was one of the most dramatic, secretive, and eerily forgotten operations in all of modern military history. Billions of dollars worth of engineering, hundreds of vessels, and a decision that would be made in the shadows of post-war power, far away from public view. This is the story of what really happened to Hitler's U-boat fleet after the guns went silent in May of 1945. To understand the weight of what came after, you have to first understand what the U-boat represented, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of terror, of desperation, and of a war fought in absolute darkness. When Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare in the early years of World War II, it sent shockwaves through the Allied command. The Atlantic Ocean, Britain's lifeline, became a killing ground. German U-boats prowled in coordinated groups the Kriegsmarine called Rudeltaktik, what the Allies came to know as wolf pack tactics. They hunted in the dead of night, surfacing in the darkness, striking merchant convoys without warning, then vanishing beneath the waves before escort ships could respond. Between 1939 and 1945, German submarines sank nearly 3,000 Allied vessels. That is roughly 14 million tons of shipping, food, fuel, ammunition, soldiers, sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The human toll was staggering. Over 30,000 Allied merchant sailors lost their lives in those cold, open waters. Winston Churchill himself would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing during the entire war that truly frightened him. And yet, despite their fearsome reputation, the U-boat crews paid an almost incomprehensible price. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in German submarines during the war, more than 28,000 never came home. That is a casualty rate of over 70%, one of the highest of any military branch in the entire conflict. These were not faceless machines. They were boys mostly, young men packed into steel tubes barely wider than a hallway, breathing recycled air, surviving on adrenaline and discipline, and dying in numbers that would haunt a generation. By the spring of 1945, what remained of this once formidable force had been battered into near irrelevance. Allied anti-submarine technology had evolved dramatically. New radar systems, long-range aircraft, improved depth charges, and the breaking of German Enigma communications had turned the hunters into the hunted. U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could build them, but they kept fighting, right up until the very end. On May 4, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had built the U-boat arm from scratch, and who, in the final days of the Reich, had been named Hitler's successor, issued a ceasefire order to all German naval forces. The war in the West was effectively over. What followed was chaos. At ports across Norway, Germany, and the Baltic coast, U-boat commanders received their orders and began what would become one of the strangest surrenders in naval history. Some submarines were already at sea on active patrols. Others sat in harbour, half-finished or battle-damaged. A few were en route to ports in South America, where Nazi officials were fleeing the collapse of the Reich. The Allies had anticipated this moment. What they had not fully anticipated was the sheer scale of what they were inheriting. When the final accounting was made, the Allies discovered that hundreds of U-boats remained afloat, with many others still under construction or sitting in various stages of repair across occupied shipyards. More than 1,000 German U-boats had been built over the course of the war. The ones that survived to see the peace represented the remnant of an industrial effort almost incomprehensible in its ambition. and the technology inside some of them was unlike anything the Allied navies had produced. And that last part, the technology, was what made everything that followed so complicated. Germany's late-war U-boat designs had left Allied naval engineers quietly astonished. The Type 21 U-boat, in particular, was unlike anything the Western Allies had produced. It featured a revolutionary streamlined hull, dramatically enlarged battery capacity, and a snorkel system that allowed it to run submerged for days without surfacing. Early tests showed it could travel at speeds underwater that Allied anti-submarine vessels simply could not match. In the wrong hands, or rather in the hands of any future adversary, the Type 21 represented a generational leap forward in submarine warfare. The Americans understood this immediately. The British understood it too. And quietly, uncomfortably, both nations began to understand something else, that the Soviet Union, their wartime ally, understood it just as well. The Cold War had not yet begun in any official sense, but the temperature was already dropping. What happened next was an agreement, reached among the major Allied powers in the weeks following Germany's surrender, and later confirmed through post-war negotiations, that would determine the fate of the surviving fleet. The name attached to the disposal operation sounds almost bureaucratic. What it described was anything but. Under Allied agreements reached after Germany's surrender, the surviving U-boat fleet was to be divided among Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and France. Each power would receive a portion for study and evaluation. A handful of vessels were preserved for historical purposes or retained for active service. The rest, the vast majority, were to be destroyed. Not sold, not repurposed. Destroyed. The reasoning was partly practical and partly political. The Allies did not want a rearmed Germany, even in some distant future, to reclaim these submarines. More pressingly, they did not want their rivals, increasingly each other, to gain access to any more advanced technology than had already been agreed. Every U-boat that could be evaluated was a potential advantage. Everyone destroyed was a potential advantage denied. And so, in the autumn of 1945, the British Royal Navy began assembling what would become one of the largest deliberate fleet scuttlings in the history of naval warfare. The operation was given a name: Deadlight. 116 German U-boats were gathered at ports in Northern Ireland and Scotland, primarily at Lisahalle, near the city of Londonderry, and at Loch Ryan on the Scottish coast. Skeleton crews of British sailors, often working alongside exhausted German naval personnel under guard, moved these submarines into position. The U-boats were checked for booby traps, stripped of any remaining sensitive equipment, and prepared for their final voyage. That voyage ended approximately 40 miles northwest of Ireland, in a stretch of deep, cold Atlantic water that would come to be known simply as the Deadlight Dumping Ground. Between November 1945 and February 1946, the Royal Navy towed these vessels, one by one, sometimes in small groups, out into the open Atlantic and sank them. Some were scuttled with controlled flooding. Others were used as target practice for aircraft and surface vessels, their hulls torn open by bombs and gunfire before slipping beneath the surface. Eyewitness accounts from sailors who participated describe scenes that were almost surreally quiet. The vast majority of these U-boats went down without ceremony. No crowds watching, no journalists invited, no official photographs distributed to the public. The operation was carried out with deliberate efficiency, and the results were deliberately understated. Some boats did not cooperate with their own destruction. Rough North Atlantic weather frequently parted the tow lines, sending submarines drifting uncontrolled through the swells. At least a dozen vessels sank in locations other than the intended dumping ground, their exact resting places uncertain for decades afterward. A few crews tasked with boarding abandoned U-boats to open sea valves described equipment that still functioned, engines that could have turned over, hulls that were, against all odds, still seaworthy. Men who were there have spoken, in memoirs and interviews decades later, of an unsettling feeling about the whole operation. These were machines built by men who had fought and died in them. They were being erased, and the erasing was being done quietly, deliberately, in deep water, where no one would ever have to look at them again. The Americans, meanwhile, were conducting their own evaluation process on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States Navy had claimed a number of high-priority U-boats for technical study, including several Type 21s. These submarines were sailed across the Atlantic under their own power, crewed by German prisoners under American supervision, and brought to ports in New England and the Chesapeake Bay for thorough examination. American naval engineers spent months dismantling German submarine technology and incorporating what they learned into the next generation of U.S. submarine design. The influence of the Type 21 can be traced directly into American submarine construction programs that would shape the Cold War for decades. In a very real sense, the ship designs that would face off against Soviet submarines in the tense underwater standoffs of the 1950s and 1960s owed a quiet, unacknowledged debt to Germany's wartime engineering. The Soviets received their agreed share as well, and proved far less forthcoming about what they intended to do with them. Their portion of the U-boat fleet was taken east and subjected to intensive study at facilities closed to Western observers. Soviet submarine development in the late 1940s showed unmistakable signs of German influence. It was an irony that would have been bitterly recognized by the men who had built those submarines, that their technology outlived the regime that created it, and lived on in the arsenals of both sides of a war that had not yet officially begun. Then there were the boats that didn't follow orders. In the final days of the war, at least 2 U-boats, U-530 and U-977, did not surrender to the Allies when the ceasefire was ordered. Instead, they disappeared beneath the South Atlantic, surfacing weeks and even months later at the Argentine port of Mar del Plata. Their commanders offered explanations that were, charitably, incomplete. Neither boat was carrying passengers, they insisted. Neither had been involved in anything beyond routine patrol. The crews were interned by the Argentine government and eventually released. Conspiracy theories persisted for decades, claims that these submarines had been part of a planned escape network for senior Nazi officials, or that they had been carrying gold, documents, or high-ranking fugitives from the collapsing Reich. But historians have found no credible evidence to support any of it. No Nazi leaders on board, no hidden treasure, no secret mission confirmed by documentation or credible testimony. The dramatic versions of the story were compelling. They were also, as far as the historical record is concerned, unsupported. What remains true is simply this: 2 German submarines chose not to surrender when ordered, spent weeks in the open ocean, and arrived in South America long after the war had ended. Their commanders never offered a fully satisfying explanation, and most historians regard the lingering rumors that surrounded them as products of a post-war world hungry for mystery, rather than evidence of anything more sinister. The South Atlantic in the spring of 1945 was a vast, largely unwatched ocean. But what crossed it and what didn't is now largely understood. Some questions have answers. They are simply less dramatic than the stories that replaced them. For the men who had crewed these submarines, the survivors, the post-war world offered little comfort and less recognition. German U-boat veterans returned to a country in ruins, to cities bombed flat, to families shattered by years of war. Many found that their service was met not with understanding, but with suspicion. To the outside world, they had been instruments of terror. To themselves, they had been sailors doing their duty in the most brutal conditions imaginable. The gap between those 2 realities was enormous, and for many veterans, unbridgeable. Some former U-boat men wrote memoirs, some gave lectures, some refused to speak of the war at all for the rest of their lives. A small number found second careers in the navies of West Germany or in advisory roles with other nations' submarine programs. Their expertise too valuable to ignore, their history too complicated to celebrate. The men who had built the boats, the workers in the submarine pens at Kiel, at Hamburg, at Bremen, watched their shipyards cleared, dismantled, or converted. The enormous reinforced concrete U-boat bunkers that had sheltered Germany's submarine fleet from Allied bombing, structures so massively engineered that some still stand today, impossible to fully demolish without endangering surrounding neighborhoods, became post-war curiosities, warehouses, storage facilities, tourist attractions, monuments to a kind of industrial ambition that the world had decided, rightly, it never wanted to see again. Today, if you travel to the waters northwest of Donegal Bay, off the northern coast of Ireland, you are sailing above one of the largest collections of wartime submarines anywhere on Earth. Most of Operation Deadlight's U-boats rest at depths between 200 and 500 feet. The cold, low-visibility water of the North Atlantic has preserved them in a kind of dark suspension, rusting slowly, silently, in the darkness below. Divers have visited some of the shallower wrecks. What they describe carries a weight that photographs cannot fully capture. Conning towers still intact, pressure hulls bent and cracked by depth charges or deliberate scuttling. And inside, when hatches are open enough to see, the remnants of the world those young men inhabited. Gauges, pipes, controls, the architecture of a life lived underwater, in fear, in purpose, in absolute commitment to a war they did not survive to see end. There is no memorial at the Deadlight site, no marker on the surface to indicate what lies below. The Atlantic simply continues, grey and indifferent and enormous, as it always has. Hundreds of surviving U-boats were accounted for when the peace came. Scuttled, scrapped, sunk, or quietly dismantled in the service of a new world order that had no place for them. The ones sent to the bottom of the North Atlantic never came back up. They were meant to disappear. And largely they did. What we are left with is not a simple story of victory over evil, though that element is certainly present. It is something more complicated, more human, the story of machines that were instruments of mass destruction and objects of extraordinary engineering. The story of young men who gave their lives to something that failed, and of an old order that tried, in its final hours, to ensure its most dangerous creations would vanish without a trace. They almost succeeded. The water runs deep off the Irish coast, and the silence down there is very old. But history has a long memory, longer than any ocean, and some things, no matter how deliberately they are buried, have a way of rising back to the surface. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the parts of history that are deliberately hidden beneath the waves, consider subscribing. Every week we go deeper into the forgotten corners of the Second World War, the decisions made in secret, the equipment buried in silence, and the human lives caught between. Leave a comment below with what you'd like us to cover next. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it with them. The history is waiting.